Hey everybody, I am here with Zophar. Holy crap, I'm talking to Zophar. I have been on your website since it launched, I think. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm doing really well. How you doing?
Good. It's exciting to talk to you. Since I started RetroRGB, I've crossed paths a couple of times with people that I talked to back in the 90s when I had my site, you had your site, and it's just such a trip to just to see each other again after all these years. I don't think we interacted too much, but everybody knew who you were, obviously, everybody in the emulation scene. So
I appreciate that. I'm glad you visited it. Glad you enjoyed it. Definitely feels weird coming back a little bit after 20 plus years, but I was impressed at just how many people still remembered the old days and everything that we did.
absolutely. So for any of the younger crowd that's listening, would you give just a very quick overview of what Zophar's domain and Zophar's realm was, and just like the short version, and then we'll get back to the beginning in a minute because I want to hear this story myself.
Oh, for sure, for sure. So Zophar's domain was and is an emulation centered website that I created back in November of 1996. The whole idea behind it was back then. I was a teenager. I was 16 years old when I, created the site, and I just wanted to play video games and have fun. And the next generation consoles, back then, next generation was PlayStation, Saturn, N64, had come out recently. And I found myself really wanting to play my old Nintendo, Genesis, and Super Nintendo games because to me, 5, 6, 7 years ago was incredibly retro and old. But half my system stopped working. The Nintendo, you would sit there blowing on the cartridges, which of course we know now you don't do that, but what did we know when we were kids, right? Like, no, it's working. It's going to make it better. So, half my systems just stopped working. Sega CD wouldn't read my discs. So I turned to the internet to see if there was another solution for someone that just wanted to play their old games again. And I found out that there were some programs out there called emulators, but there were all different kind of sites that just had pieces of the puzzle. Like one site had the Nintendo emulator, one site had the
Hmm.
Super Nintendo emulator, another one had a front end for it, which we can get into later what front ends were. Another site just had news about emulators. Nothing had everything in one place. So I said, well, it doesn't seem like it exists. So why don't I go find a group of people that are awesome and we'll make it ourselves? And that's what we did. And that was 25 years ago.
That is such a trip because what's funny is there's a small chance that the site that was just news about emulation was mine, the Emulatorium. I had that
I
for like
remember.
2 or 3 years about at the exact same time. I think it was around 96, 97, 98. And then, I remember I had mine on GeoCities with a little counter and it hit 1,000 at one
I
point.
remember
And my mind
GeoCities.
was, 1,000 people went to my site. It's just yeah, that is so funny. But I mean, it's basically the same origin story in that like I was just fascinated about different ways to play games, and I couldn't keep, or a lot of people that I knew were trying to do it, a lot of people in the 90s, so like 7 probably, but couldn't keep up with all of the different stuff being released. So I just slapped that together just as a fun thing and would basically troll everybody else's sites for info, and then as soon as I saw a new version pop up, I would list it. But I remember listening to your site back then because you had hosted a bunch of them.
Oh yeah, and it's funny you said how you basically got information. Everybody did the same thing. The way that I got information to Zophar's domain is I would go to Archaic Ruins, Node 99, if you remember these sites,
Hmm.
and then
Hmm.
the emulator authors' websites themselves, and they would frequent IRC, the old way you would chat, well before things like Discord. And so I would just constantly get the news that way, and I would pop the information right onto the website, onto Zophar's domain.
That's funny. And so you were actually hosting the emulators in a lot of these cases, right? Sometimes
And
linking back to the developer, but sometimes actually uploading them on your site.
yeah, in some cases. So, for example, Icer Addis, who created some of my favorite emulators of all time, which were Nesticle, the Nintendo emulator, Genesis, the Genesis emulator that he created, and a little lesser known one called Callus, which was a
Hmm.
CPS arcade emulator. Think like Street Fighter Two and Quiz and Dragons and that era of Capcom games.
Hmm.
And I have Zophar's Domain hosted the official mirror site to those. We called them shrines. There was a shrine to Nesticle, a shrine to Genesis, a shrine to Callus, and it would have everything that was on his site. It would have news, information, updates. It would have the mirrored files. We hosted the ZSNES official mirror. We also hosted some emulators, like there was one called Nestin. You may or may not
Hmm.
remember. that predated FCU. And that was the official emulator site was right there on Zophar's domain. And we also hosted some other websites as well. Like, I don't know if you ever heard of Shining Force Central, which is a big shrine to the Shining Force series.
Hmm.
That used to be on Zophar's domain as well. ShiningForceCentral.zophar.net was the URL. So we had quite a few websites like that originally Zophar's domain hosted, and then they eventually broke out and became their own thing. So it was an honor to be able to host a lot of these people that went on to do some amazing things. Far more amazing than anything I ever did, I'll tell you.
Yeah, same. It's so funny too, because if you think about, like, we must be about the same age then, and you think of us as kids back then, and my favorite things in the world were, like, anything electronic related, especially video games, like heavy metal, and then I got into beer, even probably way too younger than I should have. And then you fast forward 20 something years, and my favorite things are heavy metal. I run a website about that does the same thing that I basically did in the 90s, where I just get information and help promote other people's work. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm both proud of that and, like, a little weirded out. Like, did I really not grow up at all? So,
Yeah. Speaking of age, I actually just turned 42 yesterday, and it was funny. I was thinking about, oh man, 42. It's all downhill from here. But then somebody said yesterday, like, no, Zophar, you're not 42. You just leveled up. You reached level 42. I was like, good point. Why did I never think of that?
that is
So we're not
pretty
getting
awesome.
we're not getting older, Bob. We're leveling up. We're getting
I'm
more
probably
experience
gonna
points.
I'm gonna steal that when I talk to my fellow nerds. Yeah, I'll be 41 in July, so we were pretty close in age then.
Yeah,
So.
very close.
So I always wondered, how did you come up with the name Zophar? I was wondering if you were, like, Eastern European and that's actually your name or something, or was that just like a cool thing? Because
so
I got a friend
so
named
in
Zoltan, so that's
which is another awesome name.
yes.
Interestingly, although I am actually of Eastern European descent, that is actually true. That's not where the name for me came from. Although I know, Zophar and biblical times and all of that. But no, that for me, the name actually came from a video game. It was the background that we were talking about a little bit earlier. It's from a video game called Lunar Eternal Blue, which originally came out on the Sega CD and then later on the PlayStation.
Hmm.
Part of the Lunar series of games. So the idea was that Zophar was the final boss, really, really difficult boss that was really tough to get past, very persistent. I died on him so many times. And his final dungeon where you would battle him was named Zophar's Domain. We actually just streamed this game on Twitch a few weeks ago and finished that off. But it was such a great game that really spoke to me. Really deep story, an amazing soundtrack, and exciting characters. Very anime style driven. But for me, the whole thing was that Zophar's Domain was like the whole game, and it was a long game. It was like 50 plus hours on average. You had to battle through everything to get to Zophar's Domain. That was like where you wanted to go, where you wanted to be, where you wanted to finish it off. And then Zophar was just a super challenging, persistent, evil dude. I'm not saying I'm evil, but like he was persistent, and he was trying to take over the world and bend things to his will. And so I just thought that's kind of a cool idea of this place that you're trying to get to, and that once you get there, it's everything that you've been looking for. So I said, well, I'm just going to name the website Zophar's Domain. It's going to be like this really cool, mystical place that you can get all these things called emulators from that a lot of people hadn't heard of. I had never heard of it, a year prior to making the site.
Hmm.
And then I said, well, if it's going to be called Zophar's Domain, whose domain is it? I guess I'll just call myself Zophar on the internet. And I did. I named myself Zophar, and Zophar's Domain was my domain. But I want to make it clear right now that that website was not just me. Far from it. I had so many great people over the years that worked on that website. And if it hadn't been for the dozens and dozens of people that helped to contribute articles and maintaining the sites and writing scripting for it, like we had a gentleman named Alan, who went by the name of Infi, that created a lot of scripting in Perl, if you remember Perl,
Hmm.
back in the 90s. And he, that was the basis for things like our forums. It wasn't easy to find forums back then. Like, how would you post things? Like, this was the wild, wild west of the internet. So he helped, to modify and code that for us. He coded polls for us back when no one was really doing polls. I loved putting polls up there, just asking people's feedback before the days of surveys. Again, I didn't know what any of this stuff was, but it's like, this would be really cool to get feedback. Let's go create a poll. And that's kind of how the name Zophar's Domain and the name Zophar took hold.
That's awesome. That's so much cooler a story than mine. When I was a kid, I wanted something with heavy metal in the name, and everything was taken, like Metal Bob or Guitar Bob or something. So I typed in the word metal and punched my keyboard, and then it was like metal with a string of random numbers and letters after it. And that was my screen name for like 5-6 years or something. It made no sense. Terrible story, but it's the
Nice.
truth. So
Nah, it's all good. It's awesome.
so you when you started the site, it eventually transitioned over to being run by other people, and then it still was a hub for a place. Still is a hub where you could get a ton of different emulators. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that was like, and why you passed it along and all that?
Sure, sure. So basically, like I was saying, I founded it in November 9th of 96. And I ran the site for a little under 4 years. And it started out, interestingly enough, it was on GeoCities for a week. It was like my little beta test, putting it on GeoCities, which I couldn't tell you what the URL was anymore, because as you remember, it was different numbers and names of like streets and who knows. So I don't know what that was called back then, but we eventually, we launched it as Zophar's domain. And we started out with a very small team of maybe 4 or 5 people. We had a person that made the graphics for it, because I have no graphical talent whatsoever. We had a gentleman I was telling you about that did the programming for it. We had another person that was helping to maintain the emulator pages themselves with me. And then there was me that was basically doing the rest, helping to update the site, always updating the news page. So it started out with just like the four of us. And then over time, it started to expand. We added more sections and we added more pages, and we had a utility section and a translation section with the first translation I ever saw, which was the Final Fantasy V Demi-Force translation project from Steve Demeter. And I don't know if you're familiar with Ernie Smith from Tedium. He's author of the short form blog, and he's on Twitter. He actually was the person that maintained our poll section for us in the beginning and wrote all the articles for Zophar's domain. And then he went on to do all kinds of journalistic activities. Awesome guy. He's still around. But over the years, about 3 years into it, the site had really ballooned and become incredibly popular. Now it's hosting things like save states and speed runs. Back before speed running was a thing, I just called them Zophar's domain contests. How fast can you get through a game? And they would submit little, I don't know if you remember this, the NSM files from Nesticle that logged the controller inputs. So it basically was like a movie, but instead of it being a giant file that you'd never be able to stream back in the 90s because of bandwidth and space limitations, they were like 30, 40, 60 kilobytes. But the site had become massive. And at one point, we had over 20 people at one time working on that site. So pretty much I was working so I was going to school, right? I was in high school up until, mid 98. And then I went to college. And I'm trying to do all of that. At the same time, I'm trying to run Zophar's domain. The ad revenue that the site generated in the second half of the time I maintained it, I was giving the vast majority of it to my team, because I felt weird about keeping ad revenue when all these people are helping to make the site what it is. So I was basically writing checks. Yeah, I was writing personal checks in the 90s, just, giving them the money that the site had generated for their hard work. And so when we got to 2000, to be totally honest, Bob, I was burned out. I was updating that site at all hours of the night. There would be times where I would just be up at like 2 a.m. Oh, new emulator from Spain released. I don't know if you remember ESNES. So different time zones. So like, the new one's out. I gotta get this up. I gotta get the scoop. And I'd sit there and I'd update the thing and I'd put what was changed and I'd upload the file, and then I'd go on IRC and I'd say, hey, new ESNES up. And it became 60 to 70 hours a week on this website. And I loved it, but it just got to the point where I said, okay, well, the site is all I'm doing now. I really need to decide what do I want to do? At that point I was still living with my parents. I had just turned 20 now. And I'm like, gotta decide, is this what, if this is going to be my career, is this what I'm going to do? Is this really what I want? And I just decided that what I wanted to start a family, and I wanted to, go finish all kinds of things in school. And, I had all these different ideas and dreams and things like that. And I just realized that if I was to do that and continue to own and run Zophar's domain, the site would just turn into something that I wouldn't have been proud of at that point. I wouldn't have been able to dedicate the attention that I thought it deserved, because my personality has always been, when I go after something, I go after something. I tackle it, like what I'm trying to do right now with Twitch the last couple of months. I attack it full force. So there was a gentleman who worked on the site who actually was also one of our programmers, helped to maintain the scripts and things of that nature, the forums, the polls, all that good stuff on the site. And, his name was Sam. And he had interest in acquiring the site. And so, we talked, we discussed, and ultimately in 2000, I transferred ownership of Zophar's domain to him. And from about mid-2000 onwards, he became the person who made the decisions and essentially owned Zophar's domain. And it stayed like that for a number of years. I know that at some point he transferred ownership to another gentleman named Ed, who runs it and specifically owns it to this day. And he has his own team of people that help to maintain it and run it, and things like that. And then the pandemic happened. And a bunch of I don't know how deep you want me to go into this part.
Keep
But
going. I'm all in, man.
so the reason why I returned after all these years, I had dabbled every now and then. I made a little bit of an appearance. Like I would jump in, say hi to people. Hey, how's everything going? And oh, this is great. And at one point, I received posting privileges back again on Zophar's domain because I said, hey, I'm kind of dabbling back again. So Ed went ahead and gave me, posting privileges if I wanted to. I didn't really take advantage of it though, because I was in, I was out. I had a full-time career at this point. I was married, I have a kid, and everything's going great in my life. And then, in the back of my head all these years, I've always said to myself, like, but what if, I would think about the stuff I left behind, right? But then I remember, right, this is what I wanted. I wanted a career. I wanted a family. I wanted, children. Like this is what I wanted. So I gave this up for that. And then the pandemic happened, and someone that I worked with, I'm a manager, just so you know, I've been the manager for almost 20 years now since leaving Zophar's domain. So I went from being the manager and owner of Zophar's domain to managing someone else's company, right? So funny how that works out. But when the pandemic happened, everything what became very chaotic, which life changed, and everyone's trying to figure out what to do, and companies are scrambling, and so the amount of stress at my job became far more than it has been, because being a manager can be very stressful, but it became much more stressful than it ever had been up until that point. But I maintained, I went through it. I remembered, this is my career, and this is my family, and this is what I want to do. And then someone that used to work for me a long time ago came into my office. And I just remember it being very, very busy. It was right during the holiday season. Where I work, it's very busy during the November, December, January months of the year. So he was trying to tell me something, and I remember being on my computer trying to respond to some kind of communication. And I said, hey man, listen, I'm really sorry, really busy right now. I'll tell you what, let's talk in a month or two from now, once the holidays calm down, we'll catch up. I promise, man. It's really good to see you. I'm just really busy right now. And he said, all right, man, no problem. And he left, and he ended up getting COVID-19 2 weeks later. And then he passed away 3 weeks after that.
Oh,
he
man,
was 51.
That sucks.
I understand. It's what can you do? But after that happened, I still couldn't tell you, Bob, to this day. I don't know what I was doing. I know I was looking at my computer and reading an email. I couldn't tell you what it was. I don't know what it was. It was so important that I couldn't just spend, 10 minutes talking to this nice gentleman, really kind soul that I hadn't seen in a long time. That just stopped by the office just to, pick some stuff up and wanted to say hi to me. So it got me thinking, I hate to say, you don't want to have regrets, but I really regret that. So then somehow that got me thinking, well, what about all the stuff we used to do in the 90s and Zophar's domain, and I wonder I couldn't back then. I could not find a way to if it could have been my career, if I could have made a legitimate career out of it where this is what I do. I start my day. Zophar's domain is my passion and my career, and it would generate the kind of income. If it had been able to do that back then, I would have been more likely to stick with it. But it couldn't. It was a lot of time I was putting in, and the money that it was generating was mainly going to the people that I felt deserved it the most, the team around me. But now I'm things are a lot different now. I know there's YouTube and Twitch, and there's streaming, and there's all this stuff, because it's not like I just shut everything off and stopped looking at things completely. I would check in, I would dabble, and I'd be like, oh, this is cool. Modern Vintage Gamer's awesome, and RetroRGB, and all. I was watching. So I'm like, I don't want to have any regrets. I could be on this earth another 30 to 40 years, I hope, or I could die next week. I don't know. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to dabble. Let me go check out some streaming stuff, see what people are doing. I'm a big fan of speedrunners. I'm not a speedrunner myself. I have no talent, just to be clear to everybody. I have no
same
talent.
And same. I'm a huge fan, but I can't do it myself.
Yeah, exactly. I came in the top 100 one time in a Saturn contest in the mid 90s, and I won a poster. That's the extent of my speedrunning. The 98th fastest time, but that's it. So, I started watching speedrunners and people like Arcus and RetroRunner, who are big Ninja Gaiden speedrunners, and a whole bunch of them. And somehow I don't remember how the topic came up. So my name, I call it a handle. Every time I say handle, like, oh, you're from the '90s, aren't you? But the name, of course, is Zophar 1 because somebody else had Zophar, which is fine. And someone recognized the name. They're like, wait, are you the Zophar of Zophar's Domain? I was like, whoa, there's people that remember this? So I was like, well, yeah, it was a long time ago. And they're like, what? And then people in the chat just start, Zophar, no way. And I'm like, whoa, my God, it's just got to be a random coincidence. I probably just went to like this one speedrunner where the community is from the Zophar's Domain days. But then like I started going to different runners and in different just casual channels. And every time it comes up where someone asks about the name Zophar, like a bunch of people were remembering it and having fond memories. And like I had one person, this is going to sound crazy, like, they're like, oh, it changed my life. I was like, nah, no way. But like, no way. And they started explaining like how the games were part of their childhood. And, then their games broke down, like all these stories, like the reason why I created the site, like it touched people, which, is kind of, is really, a little emotional, like thinking, that's crazy. I can't believe it. Like, it's amazing. So I'm like, well, it seems like there are still people here. So what if I just try to dabble, get back into it? And that's kind of the whole full circle story of of Zophar's Domain. And to this day, Zophar's Domain is still up, although I don't actively run or maintain it. I do dabble in there every now and then. I poke my head in. When I started streaming on Twitch in January, I did put a post up, just letting people know, hey, I am streaming now if you want to check out some casual gaming, and then that brought us to the current point.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw you liked a post of mine on Twitter, and I went, holy shit, is that the Zophar? And that's when I just messaged you right away, like, this is crazy. Like, I remember all of that, and sorry, my headphones just cut out.
No, you're good.
But yeah, that was nuts. And it's a lot of people are having the same reaction too, and I've seen, every time that's the same thing too. When I saw you active on Twitter, a bunch of other people were like, same shit. Holy crap, it's Zophar. So yeah, a lot of people absolutely remember, and the website has and still makes a big difference when you're looking for any kind of software emulation solution.
I appreciate you saying so.
Hell yeah, you said so many things that just tripped so many different memories, and like even the GeoCities, not your GeoCities / a bunch of numbers and stuff. I don't even remember if I bought a domain back then, because it wasn't like it is today. There was no GoDaddy where you just drop $5 and get a domain. Like there was a lot more involved. I might have, but it might have.
I remember how we did it. We went to the Inter-NIC. I don't even know if they're around anymore, but that was what they were called, the Internic or the Inter-NIC. And you had to basically purchase a domain name. I want to say it was like, I don't know, maybe $50 or $60. It wasn't a ton of money, but it was like $50 or $60 maybe. And you would go and register the IP addresses that were associated with your server, and then they would just give you the domain. And it was that simple. And it wasn't like this whole people would buy domains and then resell them and squat on them. And there was really none of that. There was a Zophar.com ultimately that was bought because I decided I wanted Zophar.net because net just sounded cool. Like,
Yeah.
oh, it's Zophar.net. If I had the foresight back then to know, like, I probably should have bought all of them, like .com, .net, .org. Like, but I was a teenager. I didn't have a lot of money. So I'm like, okay, Zophar.net, it's like $50 or $60. I'll go for it. But I purchased it that way. And, every time I would change servers, I had to go onto the Inter-NIC's website and I'd have to modify the, server IP addresses and whatnot. But that was how you did it back then. It was the wild, wild west of the internet. None of this was taught in schools that I'm aware of. There was no book that told you any of this. And there was no Google, by the way, to be clear at the beginning of this. I just basically had to, kind of scour the internet myself. Back then it was the age of Alta Vista and Excite and Yahoo. They were around.
Yahoo, yeah.
And I would just sit there and you know how, I don't know if you remember this, the way that Zophar's Domain popped up in all the search engines, I added them. Back then, it wasn't like this technological spidering where it would go and the bots would find site. No, it was a little link at the bottom that says submit your site. And I sat there on Yahoo, Alta Vista, Excite, Ask Jeeves. Remember Ask Jeeves? Lycos. And I sat there, and it just took a long time. And I would just write up a little thing about Zophar's Domain. Here's the website, and here's what it is. And I would hit submit, and then like within a few days, a moderator would approve the thing, and there it was. It's in the search engine now. You can now find it. That's how I did it.
I feel like that's what I did, because I definitely couldn't have afforded a, 15 years old or something to spend $60 on a domain. So I remember a lot of what you said. So I think that might have been what I did, is manually submit to Yahoo and Alta Vista. Those are probably the only two I did, and to get it to pop up in the search results. So man, what a trip. And
Yep.
how are you hosting back then? I mean, like, how are you hosting files? Because it wasn't, it's not like today where you can just have a website and upload some stuff with an FTP just directly. Didn't you have to build some
Oh,
kind of?
but that's exactly what I did. But you needed servers with which that you could go and FTP files up there to. So, with GeoCities, they gave you almost nothing. There was very little
Right.
space. Pretty much you could put up HTML files, some graphics, and there you go. Which is why the site only lasted there a couple weeks. But I moved on to my ISP, which at the time was a company based where I live called ZipLink. And they allowed, I can't remember what the number was, some tiny number, like 10 megabytes of storage or something silly like that. And basically, the way the site grew was as I changed servers, they started giving me more space and bandwidth. It allowed me to do more. So, every time we would change over, it was ZipLink, and then it was VoiceNet, and then it was, I want to say, what was it called? Militia, and then Internexus. And then ultimately, we settled on ZTNet. Not to be confused with ZDNet, totally different. But
Mm-hmm.
ZTNet, which was run by a gentleman named Zach. And the agreement he had, if I recall this correctly, Zach, if you're watching this and I'm getting the agreement wrong, I'm really, really sorry. I'm just going by 25 years of memory. But I think the agreement was, hey, use what you need for storage space. We'll take care of space. We'll take care of the bandwidth. You don't pay us anything. We're going to run advertising on Zophar's domain in various spots where we tell you to pop the ads. And then, we'll take a cut. We'll give you a cut and da-da-da-da. And, go ahead and run wild was basically, in a nutshell, the agreement within reason. So, yeah, I would sit there. The program I used, I don't know if you remember, we're going back in time, but there was a program called Qt FTP. A
Oh
little
yeah.
yellow icon. That was the
Yep.
program that I used from like late '96 onwards. I would go into Qt FTP and I had a mirror of Zophar's domain on my local computer, and I would sit there and one by one at a time. This is how I did it. I would upload the files. So anytime I updated the site in the beginning, before we had scripts to do this stuff, I literally sat there in Notepad. That's how I designed Zophar's domain in the beginning. We used Notepad. Oh yeah. And I would sit there and edit the HTML code and edit the comments and change the links to the names. And I would upload the thing. And then if I saw I made a mistake, oops, that was not a capital F. That was a lowercase f, because Unix case sensitive. I was like, oops, let me re-upload that. So like there were times if you caught Zophar's domain at a particular point, you could catch me making mistakes and then re-uploading them very quickly. It was really amateur hour. No one knew what we were doing back then. And that's how I learned. I figured all this stuff out basically, Bob, by just messing up, making mistakes and learning and being like, oh, guess I'm not going to do that again. you
So
learn
that's
what not
still
to
how I
do.
learned. That's still how I learned. Everybody that works with me
Same.
will vouch for that.
Nice.
Yeah, that's man, that's such a cool thing. Do you remember interacting with some of the devs back then, some of the emulator developers?
Oh, absolutely. I interacted with quite a few of them. Like I said, the one I idolized, and they're all amazing people.
Mm.
But Iser Addis was just amazing because he was, how I told you, like the whole idea behind Zophar's domain was it was like this mystical place and, shrouded in darkness and you only reveal so much information. Well, he was a lot like that. Like I didn't even know his name was Iser Addis until years later. But he operated, kind of in the shadows, and he would just pop up with a new version and he'd be really cryptic about, things. And it was just a different kind of, like, the emulator had the little dripping blood in Genesis, and Nesticle had I won't go deep into, what I'm talking about, just different
Yeah.
interesting graphical styles that he had. And it was just really impressive. He teamed up with a gentleman named Ethan, who went by the name of Hellbent, that designed a lot of the graphics for him. And just, it was amazing. So I ultimately was beta testing those emulators for him. I was one of many. I was not the only one. There were many, many, many good people that did that. But I was like, man, this is awesome. Like I would love, if there's anything I can do for you, man, you just let me know. I have a really crappy computer. If you're trying to test your emulators on crappy computers to see how fast it'll go, I have a Cyrix 686. Anybody remember Cyrix?
Oh, of course.
Oh my God, those things are, and they're gone now. But I was like, yeah, I got a Cyrix 166 plus with 4 megs of RAM. I'm happy to beta test whatever you want, and we did. And Every time he'd throw me a new version, I would try, a whole bunch of different games. But what's interesting about that era and interacting with the emulator authors is I spent all this time, which I'm proud that I did. I'm happy to do it again. But I spent all this time testing the games. I'll be honest, Bob, I didn't play like 98% of them. There's this giant gap in my gaming from the years around 96 to 2000 where I missed out on a ton of games because basically I would spend like hours and hours watching the same first 10 minutes of random video games, just testing them out. You can't really play them. So part of like why I'm, when I came back and I started streaming is I want to kind of enjoy all the games that like I missed like when I was in the emulator community. I missed them all.
I know that feeling so well. I've played the first level of Bonk's Adventure probably 1,000 times, and that's it. Just every time I test, because it's the solid blue background and some of the cross graphics. It's a really easy way to test video mods. But I've never actually sat down and played the game, and it's so funny to hear somebody else say that, because when you're doing testing, that's what you got to do. You got to concentrate on the things that matter, and you can't. You could appreciate the artwork and the music. That's about it. You can't really get into the game when you're testing. Or, different scenarios, but at least, when you're burning through trying to make sure you get compatibility going and all that, yeah, you have to just test the same stuff and look for the bugs.
Yep.
And
exactly. If you try to get into like the actual game and you try to go through it, you'll just get a new version that like invalidates your save file or something like that. And so it's just better off just to try it out briefly. Don't actually play it for the enjoyment, but just to look for, the bugs.
Yeah. I remember a couple of things. Like, I'm starting to remember thinking about all of this stuff. There was, when Super Nintendo emulators first came out, there was always a thing about could it reproduce the rain in A Link to the Past in the opening? Because some of the original developers, I guess, couldn't get every layer working right. And I remember talking to Kevin Horton about that a couple of years ago. And he basically looked at me like, of course, that's easy. What are you talking about? I'm like, dude, you're older than me. How could you not remember the 90s when everybody was trying to get that right? And he's like, yeah, I don't remember, but I certainly do. Do you remember any of that?
Oh, I remember it vividly. And it wasn't just Rain and Zelda. There were all kinds of, effects in different games. Like, for example, I remember in Genesis emulation in the beginning when they were trying to get the Genesis to work, you were missing all kinds of channels of sound because there was no information on any of this stuff. So that the Sega Genesis used not just a PSG chip, right, programmable sound generator, like other systems did, but it also used a Yamaha synth chip. It was a Yamaha 2612, if I recall, and there was no documentation on any of this stuff. So all of this stuff had to be reverse engineered. Like any of the stuff you see, like Yoshi's Amazing NES Tech Doc from the mid '90s, none of that stuff. 99% of it is not leaks from, at least back then, they weren't leaks from Nintendo and Sega and Atari or whatever. They were very talented, very gifted programmers of the community that were basically reverse engineering everything in a way, like, how I tell you with Zophar's Domain, I would sit there, with Notepad and just reverse engineer. And no, that didn't work. Let's try this. Oh, that's the wrong thing. Let's do this. Well, at a much, much, much higher level, because what I did, I don't think it requires talent, just required dedication. What they do requires talent. Like, you got to sit there and figure it out. And, oh, okay, well, maybe it worked like this. Maybe the processor worked like this. Oh, this crashes the game. Maybe I'm off by like 1 megahertz in terms of the frequency of the clock. And it's involved. So yeah, when it comes to things like the Rain and Zelda or missing sound channels in Sonic the Hedgehog or any you could go on all day about the different pieces that were just difficult to emulate. It's because they didn't have the documentation. Everything had to be reverse engineered. So they started with the easier stuff first. And then as they got that working, then they would try to reverse engineer another portion, then another portion. Then they eventually started to figure out all the neat little hidden features, the undocumented features, we'll say, of the Super Nintendo's processor with the Mode 7 scaling. I don't know if you remember, but in the beginning, Mode 7 didn't work. The Final Fantasy 2, which was 4, but Final Fantasy 2's opening sequence with the airships and whatnot, none of that worked. That didn't work. Yep. it looked completely wrong, or it was just blank. And they figured it out over time. But I think that a lot of people now, like, I don't want to say people take it for granted, but people that weren't around back then don't know just how much work it takes to program an emulator when you have no information on the emulator. You have no information on the processor. You have no information on the hardware. Everything you learn is just through reverse engineering. And so, that was what really drew me to the community back then, was just, here's a way to play old video games, but like, it's like always changing. Things are always happening. Like every day there's some new thing that works, another game that now is working, or another sound effect that sounds better. I was when I was Twitch streaming, we did a little 25th anniversary of Nesticle, and I was playing Nesticle using, in true Zophar's domain fashion, I was running Nesticle within Windows XP, which was in a virtual machine on Parallels running on my Mac. So I just thought that was kind of funny, kind of fitting, and it worked.
Absolutely.
But I'm like playing the game. I'm playing. We played a few things. We played Metroid. I think we played Solstice, a few others. And I'm listening to the sound, and I'm like, ugh. That's not even close. But in 1997, like,
Yeah.
whoa, my mind is blown. Like I'm playing Mario on my computer, man. Like it sounds great. Like when all the other emulators had no sound, this one has, like, you know.
Right.
So but it really makes you like appreciate the amazing things these emulator authors like Iseratus for Nesticle Genesis and Callus did, and SNES 9X and ZSNES. I got to beta test for them, ZS Night and Demo. That was another amazing emulator. That one was coded almost completely in assembly language, and just, you know, amazing stuff that the authors did. So it was an honor to be able to, you know, beta test for them and give them suggestions and feedback.
Yeah. Do you remember, it was floating around for a couple of months, but there was a fake Super Nintendo emulator, and it looked, you know, it was just like it installed, and it had like a basic GUI, and you would have to do a CPU check, and the joke was that it was a CPU that didn't exist. So it was something like a Pentium 2 without MMX was the only one that it would run on. And there was all these people like, "Oh yeah, it runs great," but it was just a prank. It wasn't real, because you
There
couldn't.
was I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I couldn't remember what it was. Either it said you needed a Pentium 2 without MMX, or it was something where like all the words they used were correct. It just, the one thing that they said it needed didn't exist, because that was the joke, because it wasn't a real emulator.
Yeah, there were if I recall, there were a lot of fake emulators like that back then. I know what you're talking about. I can't remember what it was called. I wish I could. I'm sure I'll remember this like after we're done our interview. But yeah, there were a bunch like that, and I had to be really careful with Zophar's domain. Like I never uploaded, and I'm not saying I was 100% perfect. Like I had a lot of staffers, and sometimes mistakes occasionally happen. But I was very careful that any emulator that went on Zophar's domain, or any emulator that we reported on that came out, we had to test it first. We had to run it, make sure it did something. And if we couldn't verify that it did anything, you know, we wouldn't put it up there. There were a bunch like that. And the one that you're talking about, I cannot remember the name, but I remember because it's acting like it's testing things, but it wasn't actually doing that. I don't think it
Yeah.
was a malicious file. I don't think it was like a
No,
virus, or
it's
I
just a
just think
prank.
it was a very clever prank. Exactly. That just had a lot of cool flair when it was scanning for things, like it was doing stuff, but was actually doing not a thing. If I
Yeah, because
remember the name of it, God, I'm sorry.
no, that's it. Because I remember it wasn't on Zophar's domain, so I was like, well, I wonder if they just haven't had time to upload it yet. And obviously, it was because it was fake. And Super Nintendo was always my favorite console, so it's just like that one always stuck with me. And it took me like it took me a good day to realize it was a prank, because I had a 486 at the time, or maybe even a 386. So there was no way it was running on my computer. And I remember going to school talking to my cousin Scott about, hey, do you think you can get that running on your computer? And he's like, well, what does it need? And then we talked through, and he's like, that doesn't exist. I'm like, oh, you're right. Oh, I bet it's a prank. Somebody's messing with us. So yeah, there's a couple back then. Did you ever talk to Marat Faisalin?
Very briefly, his name, if I recall, was RST38H, an interrupt in programming. It's a long time ago. But so going back in time now, I'm a teenager, I'm a kid, I don't have a lot of money. He was one of a few emulator authors who was charging for his emulator. It was $35. I'll never forget it. You could download a freeware version that didn't have sound. But if you wanted to get sound in the emulator, you'd have to pay $35 for the emulator. I also think there might have been like a nag screen maybe, or like text over it. I'm not 100% sure on that. But I kind of remember there being something else about the emulator that might have been removed. So I didn't really talk to him very much, because at the time, a lot of us were of the mentality that, emulation, the whole idea is you're reliving the past, and it shouldn't cost money for the emulators themselves, which was, just to be clear, not the right mentality. this is a teenager's, a
We were
kid's
kids.
perspective.
Yeah.
We were kids. What do we know? And I do feel badly years later, just looking back. Like I wish I had interacted with him more and been supportive, and because all of the free emulators, I was all about supporting and beta testing and all of that. And when it came to any of the emulators that cost money, there were a few. INES was one of them from Murat Faizullin. There was a VSMC. I don't know if you remember that one, Virtual Super Magicom, which was a Super
Mm.
Nintendo emulator. That one had when you played the free version of it, it had a yellow screen, like looked like a Game Boy almost, and no sound also. And if you wanted to have the palette be 256 colors like a Super Nintendo should be, and sound, you had to, same thing, pay $35. And then there was Bleem was another one. Do you remember Bleem, the PlayStation emulator?
Oh, of course, yeah. I don't think I
Yep.
I don't think I used Bleem, but I definitely remember it from from the moment it was out there.
Yep.
There was a funny thing. I distinctly remember this, and I talked to Marat a few years ago, and I told this story, and he definitely didn't remember it the same way. And I don't know why I lost my guts. I didn't push him on it because I thought it would be a funny story, but I remember when he was charging for that, and I was a shitty kid, right? So like I didn't have any money, and I really wanted to use the feature where you could dump the audio tracks so that you could listen to video game music, because that's something that no one had ever done back in the day. And it's neat just to think of like, oh yeah, remember this music from the last level, oh, I love that song or whatever. So somebody somewhere had posted the paid version of his emulator, and I downloaded it, and it wasn't dumping the sound files. The sound worked, but it wasn't saving it to a file. And I clicked on every button, and in the help file was his name and phone number. And he swears that he would have never put his phone number on an emulator. But I know for a fact, as much as I was an asshole little kid, I would have never gone and hunted down somebody's phone number. I would have. He's like, "Oh, you must have
He
found it on my resume." There's no way I would have
No,
done that.
I will say, I'll tell you what I remember vividly. He 100% on his website, on Murat Faizullin's website, comcan.org maybe. And if that's still around, you may want to edit this out. Just because I don't want to get him in trouble. But I vividly remember he had contact information right up on the site. Forget the emulator file. Right on his site, which had the emulators, was his contact information. Now, I will say back then, again, people didn't know. I had my email address freely at the bottom of Zophar's domain, at the very bottom. You would never do that now. No way in hell would you
No.
have an email address. Think of what the bots and the spamming. To this day,
Yeah.
without telling you what it is, but my email address that I had from back then, which I never got rid of, 98% of it is spam just from years of that email being up on the front page of a pretty popular website at the time. But
Yeah.
he 100%, Bob, he
Yeah.
had his contact info on that site. Whether it was inside the emulator, I can't remember. I could find out because I have the complete archive of Zophar's domain on disk from a few years, actually. Almost complete.
Oh.
I could find out if you really want to know.
Well, I remember calling him, and because in my mind I was like, well, if this is this thing's awesome and it's working, so he's got to have sold so many copies that how is he going to know that I didn't buy it? And I
Sure.
called him, and somebody else picked up, and I asked to speak to Marat, and he said hello, and I said hi, I'm sorry to bother you, but I have your emulator, and you said you left your number for support, and I can't get it to dump the audio files. And he's like, well, how did you get that version if you didn't pay for it? Because you didn't pay for it. And I'm on the other end of the line going, how the hell does he know I didn't pay for it? He must have either just released it or he only sold a couple of copies or something. And I think I panicked and hung up the phone or something like that. Like, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
man.
But I asked him that. He didn't remember it, and he swears that he didn't have his number up. But there's no way I would have never gone and tracked somebody down like that. That just wasn't my
Well,
style.
it also, there's another factor here that could be the case, and that's that this was such a long time ago. Like, there are things that I wrote that I went back, like when I started streaming in January, I started looking at the old archives of Zophar's domain and everything, and I'm reading stuff that I wrote, and I'm like cringing, like, oh my God, like what did I wrote something about VSMC, which was the brain. That was his emulator, the Super Nintendo one we were just talking about. And I wrote something like, everybody should demand that he stop charging $35 for this. And I'm like, oh my God, why did I say that? Like, that's horrible. But again, I was 16 years old. I didn't know.
Yeah.
So if there was one thing, like if Marat, if you're watching this, one thing I do want to say is I'm very sorry I was not more supportive of you back then. And your emulator was amazing and groundbreaking. And I'm sorry that it didn't get the recognition from the community that it should have back then, because you really set the stage for things that would not probably have come as quickly as they did had you not spent the time reverse engineering the Nintendo. So thank you.
Yeah. He's still working on it too. He has Android versions of his emulation that he sells. So it's he's still in the scene, which is pretty awesome.
It's awesome. It's awesome.
Man, so what was like the one thing back then that when it was released, like your teenage mind was blown, like holy crap, I can't believe they did this, whatever that might be.
So like emulator wise,
Yeah, anything to do with Zophar's domain, the emulation, like something that really made a difference for you in the emulation scene.
so I had, and I know I'm sure I wasn't the only one that suggested this, but when I was beta testing for Iseratus and I had, his attention, I had made a suggestion of, hey, it would be really cool if we could somehow record. I asked for recording a video, whatever that looked like, some way to record video. So like if people want to, submit their playthrough of games or whatever, like they could do it. It'd be really cool. I don't know what that looks like. And, he thought about it, and obviously having it output back then to like MPEG or, that would have been the format, I guess, back then, would have just been, it wouldn't have worked out. It would have taken way
Yeah.
too much space, way too much bandwidth if you try to upload or stream that stuff. Like just, it wouldn't have worked out. So as I was mentioning earlier in our chat here, Bob, he came up with controller logging, which
Hmm.
he called NSM format, was what it was for Nesticle. Nintendo, what was the S? I can't remember what the S was. Nintendo something movie. I can't remember what the S is anymore. Or maybe it was NSM because it was NES movie. That might have been why. But
Hmm.
it essentially logged your controller inputs, frame by frame. So each frame, what state is the controller in? What's the button press? Up, left, A, B, whatever. And you compile all of that into a file. It would log it. And then at the end, you basically, when you load it, all you're really doing is you're loading a save state and then everything that's pressed from that point. Now, that sounds like a great idea. The thing with that, though, is that all it would take is any kind of change in the timing. Maybe the ROM that you downloaded was a slightly, or found or copied or whatever, was a
Hmm.
slightly bad dump. Anything that's off by any kind of amount, and eventually what could happen is the file could desync. So case in point, interestingly enough, when I was streaming Nesticle on its 25th anniversary a few months ago, I found some of the contest winners from Zophar's Domain NSM contest. And when we played them back, two of them worked flawlessly. One of them, which was Metroid, desynced in the middle. And when I say desynced, all of a sudden Samus just started doing stupid things and shooting out of nowhere and moving to the right where there was nothing there, and it just, that didn't play back properly, probably because it was done on a version of the emulator that had different timings for the CPU. But for me, the fact that I made that suggestion and it was implemented was like, wow, this is so cool. And again, looking back on this, I'm sure I was one of a gazillion people that asked for this, but it's almost like, wow, you give feedback and like he's listening, and like my mind was blown. Not the feature itself, which was awesome, but just the fact that I could, give feedback on something, make a suggestion, and then see that feedback like implemented real time. Like that was incredible. So for me, my mind was blown anytime I would ever give feedback, and that was the one that pops into my head right now as one of the best examples of that. And that feedback was turned into a result.
I still kind of get that feeling, and I work with smart devs almost every single day, and I still kind of get that like wow, like you did that because I asked. Thank you so much. Like you're the best. This is awesome. This is gonna. So I mean, that's you could see the enthusiasm every time I talk about the stuff in the podcast too. But it's just like, yeah, I've always been so lucky to get to work with such awesome people like that. And it's so much
Oh
fun
yeah.
to see a lot of this stuff take shape and the evolution of all of it. But yeah, that's a trip. That's an important one too. I I think for me and a lot of other people our age, I think Nesticle was probably the one thing that we first loaded up and just went, holy crap, this is cool. Like there's you load the games, they actually play right. You could. I think I had a Gravis gamepad that I would try to play it on too, or something like
I
that.
had a Gravis.
Yeah, like the one that everybody had back then, I would
It
think.
for the two for me, I had the Gravis gamepad, and then later I migrated to the Microsoft Sidewinder, which was the one that eventually morphed into the Xbox controllers. But it had the kind of tapered
Hmm.
edges like this, and it
The
had,
boomerang.
the boomerang, exactly. The boomerang. Uh, and I remember Nesticle specifically added support for the Sidewinder. Being a DOS emulator when it first came out,
Hmm.
you had to have, drivers and whatnot. But this specifically had a driver for the Sidewinder if you were so inclined. So I played a lot of emulators using my Sidewinder for sure.
Yeah, that's something that definitely, I know I sound like an old man saying this, but kids of today will never understand what it was like to try to make this hardware work with the software. Because now you have drivers, and sometimes you have to force an alternate driver version, and sometimes you have to force a firmware version. But back in the day, you had to add the code to your autoexec batch file so that your computer, as it booted, would read these devices. And depending on what hardware you had, sometimes you would remove some of those devices so that your computer would be a little faster so you could actually play the game that you were looking for. So you'd have a couple of different versions of it, and just add underscore, with sound, no sound, and then just go on based on that. And that's yeah, man, this is bringing back a whole bunch of very fun memories of
It's
trying to
awesome.
figure all this stuff out and get it
and that
working.
and that was everything you're saying. That was what got me into this, just the fun of it, right? Like, not just playing the games, which was the big draw, was the games, but like, as I got more into it, I was like, you know what, it's not even just the games now, it's just the fun of groundbreaking stuff and being there when new stuff is happening, new features and new games are working, and just it was just such a fun feeling. And then that people would feed off each other, then new programmers would come into the frame and be like, all right, I can take a crack at this, and this emulator is going to do this that this one didn't do. And then when things like NetPlay were added, like Nesticle was one of the first ones to have, you could play someone on the internet. Now, it did, how well did it work? Again, this was the 90s, but just that didn't matter. Like, the whole point, the idea that you could sit there and someone like in another state can also play Nintendo with you, when the game manufacturers hadn't even figured out how to do that, like with the modern systems, right? Sega tried with the Sega Channel and all that, but like, that was just amazing. That was incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. The 56K modem.
Oh yes, oh yes. When I started Zophar's domain, I was still using a 14.4 modem. I moved on to 56K shortly thereafter, though, because I realized 14.4 was not cutting it. So went right
I
up to a
think
56.
I think I had a 33.6 at one point. I know I started out with a 14.4 and then eventually got the 56. And then I think I remember in the 2000, maybe, I got a cable modem and my mind was just blown at the difference. Like, I can't
Oh
believe
yeah, for
this is
me
the
it
same
was
thing.
when I went from a 56K dial up to DSL, which was, I remember, it was a 320 kilobits per second connection, and I was like, "Whoa, man! I'm moving at the speed of light now." Of course, now, like, now they're like up to, like, I think Comcast, what I use now, is like 900 megabits per second or some ridiculous number. But I was like, "Oh, 300 kilobits a second! We're moving at the speed of light." So I
That's funny.
remember.
Just to think of all those computers directly connected to the internet without a router or any kind of protection in front of you. Like, that's
Oh my
today your
god, I could tell you
computer would last
stories.
15 minutes
Oh,
before it was
forget
taken
it.
over by
I,
spyware.
I, I had I'll tell you a quick funny story about that since you just brought that up. So back in the IRC days of the 90s, we would go on IRC and chat about emulators, whatever. And IRC, which I don't use it today because it's just, I don't like the idea of it. I don't think it's secure. I think we've moved on to much better, more secure platforms. But back then, that was what we had. So I would enter a chat room, and it would freely display your IP address. And I wasn't smart enough back then to use a proxy. So, like, I would enter a chat room, and there's, Zophar at some crazy, whatever my IP address is, right? And so I want to say, like, maybe early 97, I would go into a chat, and all of a sudden my computer would crash. It would just go to a blue screen. I'd be like, the heck's going on here? And I'd be like, my computer's being unstable. Is it overheating? It was a Cyrix chip, piece of crap, right? I'm like, is the processor's overheating? I don't know what's going on. So I went back in, and I'm like, okay, I'm testing the computer out. Seems okay. Play a game. Everything seems okay. All right, whatever. Let me go back on IRC, tell everyone what happened. And I'd go back on IRC. I'd go into the channel. And then again, within like a minute of going into the channel, the thing would crash again. It took me, I want to say, like 6 or 7 reboots to figure out that the common link was I would go back into a particular IRC channel with my IP address displayed for everybody. And then my computer would mysteriously crash. And what it was they were taking advantage of a new denial of service attack back when people were figuring out what that was. I think it was called a land attack, I think was the name of it, which basically caused like a buffer overflow. And they basically ping you with like these packets. It's way more technically involved than I know to get into. But when I saw that was happening, I'm like, okay, there's got to be a fix for this. So I went and I looked, and people were talking about it. And then I went on Microsoft's site, and they just had released a patched my OS, and it was Windows 95 back then. Rebooted, and then all of a sudden I went in IRC and it stopped happening. And I'm sure the person watching me crash out of there was getting a chuckle every time he would ping me. But what can you? That was the days. That was the 90s.
And in hindsight, what a harmless prank! It's kind of funny. It's like
I laugh about it now.
Kind of a douche move, but like it's still.
But it is
kind
funny.
Of a harmless thing.
It didn't do any lasting damage. But like now, like instead of like stuff like that, when back then it was like pranks and silly stuff. Now you have like computers being held for ransom, and you need to pay this ridiculous amount of money, or goodbye to all your family pictures and home movies and all the stuff you've accrued over the years. Like just buy. Like it's become, instead of pranksters doing it, it's now just bad business people, right? They have entire companies overseas that their whole existence is to create programs and then infect you, and they have whole. So without going too deep into this, there's one ransomware company. They're not a company, whatever you want to call them, organization that has their own tech support, where you call a number and they actually staff the center with people to take your money and then release the key to you, like an actual. It's insane. It's ridiculous. I never would have imagined that people would turn to that kind of when back then it was silly pranks. It's not like that anymore,
Yeah, I mean that's the evolution of humans. Unfortunately, though, I'm sure there was cavemen back in caveman days that were selling, selling coconuts as rocks, and you go to fight your woolly mammoth and your rock explodes.
Oh,
and there you go. You're just like whatever. There was always people to exploit other people.
No doubt.
So what's now that you're kind of back? What is next? You're staying with Twitch to stream games, and what's now for Zophar's domain and for you?
Great question. So here's where my head's at. So first and foremost, I'm really enjoying Twitch streaming a lot. It's a lot of fun. It's a way to kind of rebuild a community, right? Because obviously it's been over 2 decades. A lot has changed, but some things have stayed the same. And I'm finding out that the more I stream, and I have a regular schedule, I stream 5 days a week on Twitch, usually at nights. Like I'll be streaming later tonight. People are coming in, like new people every day, that say, I remember Zophar's domain. I remember you, Zophar. Like I was in IRC in 96, or I downloaded ZSNest from your site. And it's just really cool. But then like we can actually talk about the games, because back then I didn't get to talk about the games. I talked about the emulators that played the games, and I maintained it, and I didn't get to play any of them. So now it's like, hey, I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoy me playing the games. Poorly, by the way, I might add. I'm not good at video games at all, but I enjoy them. I stream a lot of RPGs because it doesn't require as much reaction time. But I'm having a blast. I'm having so much fun. I'm enjoying the banter between me and the community, and we'll chat back and forth. So it's almost like it reminds me of the IRC days, except they can see me, they can hear me, they can interact with me. If they were so inclined, they can go pop on my Discord chat afterwards and we can talk. We have a little audio channel where we can just talk audio wise. Like it's not, you're no longer this faceless, nameless behind a keyboard that no one can see or hear. Like there's much more interaction now. So I'm having a lot of fun with it. So right now, my main focus is around my game streaming, my Twitch streaming. There's other things I would like to do. So obviously, you found me again through Twitter, right? I'm active on Twitter. I would like to have a YouTube presence. Right now, I have a rinky-dink channel that there's very little content at all on there. I would love, like the kind of stuff that you do. I would love to do that stuff. Back when I ran Zophar's domain, you may not remember this because this was very brief. We had a web show. Before we called them podcasts, I just called it a web show, which was called Zophar's Underworld. It was, it was very short. It was a little silly. It was 4 episodes is all I ever did of it, using real video. Do you remember real video?
Of course.
Going way back. And it was like the worst quality ever. Like I want to say it was like 40 kilobits a second or some horribly low, ridiculous rate that the images are like 3 frames a second. But it was a lot of fun for me. And so like now the technology exists to be able to, the stuff that you're doing, like the stuff that I thought about back then, but the technology just didn't allow for it. I would love to do that stuff, but right now I remember vividly that you have to focus. If you focus on too many things, you're not focusing on anything. So right
Mm.
now, main focus is Twitch streaming. I'd like to branch out to YouTube eventually. I still have to temper all of this with my current job because I am still a manager. I do still work for the same company that I've been at for the last 20 years. And so I have a certain amount of time that I can dedicate to this. So I figure, let me see where Twitch streaming takes me. I'd like to do that. I'd like to dabble a little bit in YouTube if I can find that time to create some cool content, maybe do some reviews, some musings, something like that. And then a lot of people have been asking me, believe it or not, about Zophar's domain. Like, hey, we know some people didn't know there was a Zophar. Like I get that a lot from newer people that found out about the site after I left. They're like, wait a minute, you're a person? Like you exist? I just thought it was the name. But I'm like, oh yeah. Sometimes I exist, but people that remember the site are like, hey, would you ever like want to get the site back or purchase it or whatever? And what I say to them right now, I mean, maybe one day, if Ed decided he wanted to put the thing up for sale, I guess we could have a chat about it. But right now, I'm so focused on Twitch, and I know if I ever became actively, like really actively involved in the running of Zophar's domain again, it would require a massive time commitment to the exclusion of not just Twitch streaming, which I'm having a blast doing, but it would affect my other jobs. So at that point, we would have to discuss like, all right, I have a family, I have a house and a mortgage and all this stuff. So what does that look like? So what's next for Zophar? The answer to that question is right now, I'm loving Twitch streaming. I'd love to have people come and check out my stream, check out my Discord channel. I'd love to chat with you. That's what's next for Zophar.
I will have links to absolutely all of that for everybody to connect with you. And
Appreciate
this is so cool. It was so cool getting to meet you after 25 years or something, more than that now. So it's just what a trip after all this time. And thanks so much for taking the time to do this. This is a blast.
No problem. I'm happy to do so. You're very welcome, and thanks for having me on. I definitely had a lot of fun talking to you. It was great reminiscing, and you just let me know if there's anything you need from me in the future. I'm always happy to chat.
Same. Anything you need, let me know, and hopefully we could do this again someday. And just catch up with other stuff that we remember. I bet you Modern Vintage Gamer would love to jump on too. I guarantee he remembers all of this as well. So maybe we could just have a hangout session one day and just
Yeah,
kind of just shoot the shit about the old
tell
days.
tell him I'd be super happy. He wants to chat. He wants to do a cast. Anything he wants, tell him I'm there. Same with anyone. Metal Jesus. Like there's so many awesome people. I'm happy to talk to anybody that wants to chat.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again. I will have links to all of your stuff for everybody, and hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Bob.